Hello and welcome, it's Chris from Christopher Holt Training. What we're going to be talking about in this tutorial is mobilizing the hips to help your lower back pain. Now, I've always described the hips as a pressure cooker for the lower back. So where there could be problems at the hip, what essentially happens if you've got a disc bulge or hello and welcome, it's Chris from Christopher Holt Training. Welcome to this tutorial. We're going to be talking about mobilizing the hips to help overcome lower back pain. Now, why we do that is very common that if someone's got a back problem, they're going to have tight hips. Now, this doesn't mean for everyone, but it's certainly very common. Or it could just be these muscles are inactive. So whether they're tight or whether they're inactive, what we're talking about here is going to be helpful. So we're just going to talk a little bit of anatomy. So we'll talk about some muscles. We'll talk about some movements of the hips and the movements that they do. And then we're going to put those into practice into some basic exercises. Firstly, some basic anatomy. So we've got the pelvis, which is here. We've then got big glute max muscle on the back. So that's a very powerful, very strong, active muscle. Or that's what we want it to be at least. As I mentioned, these muscles could be tight or they could be inactive. So we need to be able to get these muscles functioning correctly. So what we're going to start doing is we're going to start moving them. So we've got the glute max, the glute medius, and then a smaller one, glute minimus. Now these three muscles do three basic movements. So the glute max will do hip extension. Then we've got glute medius, glute minimus. They will do this sort of adduction, internal, external rotation of the hip. Now, as I've done it there, it doesn't really sort of make sense when it comes to movement. But when we go into the exercises, I'll explain what all that means. But essentially, we've got three muscles, glute max, glute medius, glute minimus. They're the three muscles. Big glute max, two smaller ones, glute medius, glute minimus on the side. We've got glute max, hip extension, and then we've got hip external and internal rotation. So that's all we need to know for now. So you understand the terms and you're starting to get a grasp of what the movements are. But what we're going to do next is we're going to look at three exercises where we can get those movements to be able to start mobilizing the hips so we can then start taking pressure off the lower back. I've described it a lot before that the hips are like the pressure cooker for the lower back. So if the hips become more tight or they're not working properly, you will then get problems, compensations above, which is going to cause problems in the lower back. So we need to get the hips working right, which is then going to take pressure away from that lower part of the spine. The only equipment you might need for these three exercises is a stick like this or something that you can help keep your balance. Because what we're going to do is we're going to do, first of all, it's going to be a static exercise, and then we're going to do two moving exercises. Now I start like that because the static exercises are going to be easier to grasp early on because we haven't got a great deal to think about. We've just got to be up on one leg and balancing. What we're then going to do is add movement to it, which is then going to give us a little bit more to think about. So we need improved balance, which we should get from this first exercise. And then we need to be able to coordinate our body to where we want it to go. So the first exercise that we're going to focus on would be just like a static hip aeroplane. So the hip aeroplane is going to be the third exercise that we do. But we're just going to focus on a static one of those. I'm going to use this stick. So all that's going to happen, I'm going to be stood up straight. I'm going to lift a foot from the floor. And then I'm going to extend out like that. So what I want is a nice straight leg, straight line I should say, all the way up through my body. So what I've got here is I've got a hip, extended hip. So I've got my glute max working in this extended hip. Obviously this hip's flexed and I'm balancing on there. Now again, I'm using this stick to help me balance, but I want to keep tension through this leg. So it's glute max, straighten the knee for the quads, and then also point the toes up for the lower part of the leg. That's going to start activating the muscles that we want active. You may be able to feel it this side as well, but we've got both sides of the hips, the quads, and that working. So that's going to give us our basic balance that we need. Because what we're then going to do is we're then going to start adding movement to it. So the first movement is going to be forwards and back. The second movement is going to be a rotational movement. So we've talked about exercise 1, which is the hip aeroplane, where we're just focusing on, first of all, getting the balance that we need. And if we need to use it, we've got a stick here that we can do that with. The second exercise is again single leg exercise, so we need that balance, but we're going to be moving forwards and back. Now, this would be described as like a Romanian deadlift. We don't have to use weight because we can use this stick here, but I can show you an example with weight as well, which I'll go and grab a weight in a second. But what we're going to be doing, same position, same teaching points, but this time we're going to be moving forwards and back. So if I come to the side, again, we've got a straight line. So what we're going to do, we're going to hinge at the hip. We're going to maintain the position of the spine. We're going to keep that straight leg. We're going to go forwards. We're going to hinge at the hip. We're going to get the glute max fired, quads, so the knees straight and the toes up. Then we're going to come up, but we're going to keep that straight line through the body. So we're now starting to mobilize this hip going forwards and back. What we can also do is we can push that range of movement. So if you find that you can only go, say, this far, what we can do is we can really try and push it a little bit further. So you may feel some stretch, you may feel muscles working, but that's fine for now. It doesn't want to be so hard that you can't do it, but you do want to be some challenge to the muscle. So what we've got is hinging at the hip, again keeping a nice straight line, engaging this glute, and then up. So again, we're just using the stick for balance, going back and going forward. So that's a nice, easy exercise to start getting the hip moving backwards and forwards. It's also going to develop the balance because what we're going to be doing is moving forwards and back as well. So the central gravity is shifting. So we've started off static. We've then added a little bit of forwards and back movement, which is a much easier movement than what we're going to do next, which is a rotational movement. Exercise number 3 is a more classic hip aeroplane. So it's up on one leg, so all that we talked about before still applies. We want to keep the hips extended, the knee locked and the toes up, and the straight line all the way through. The only difference now is that we're going to go back into that position, and then we're going to rotate up, and then back down. So we've done our hip extension, so we've gone from a flexed hip to now an extended hip. So that's the first movement that we talked about, and we're engaging glute max. In this exercise, what we're doing is we're now using our internal and external rotation, which is then accessing more glute medius, glute maximus. So when we go into, say, this movement, we're stretching, and then when we come out, we're activating. So again, we're getting both of the elements that we need to activate and to stretch, or certainly to mobilize the muscles and the hip joint that we need moving more effectively. So what we're going to do, again, we use the stick. We can come into this position. Now, the first movement is to internally rotate. Now, this is going to be important. We need to keep hips and shoulders aligned. So what we don't want to do is just rotate the shoulders and keep the hips where they are. We want to lead the movement from the hip. So if I turn a little bit more here, what you should be able to see is this hip rotates around, and you can see my toe now is pointing inwards. So I'm now in that position. I've also got my chest pointing in that same direction. And then I come out and I go up into this position. I can then come back down. Again, I'm trying to keep hips engaged, tummy's engaged, balance is off, but keeping the balance using the stick, opening out, coming down. So you can see this whole leg, toe points out, as I come down, toe points down, and then toe points in. So the toe's pointing where my hips are pointing, and also where my chest is pointing. So we're trying to keep all of that lined up as we go, because we want to try and avoid sort of this type of thing happening. So it wants to be, if you can see my back there, it wants to be sort of that internal rotation. So I've still got good spine here, hips are across, and then I come across and all the way through, trying to keep all lined up. You may find it twist slightly as you change hands, but that's fine. As long as it's minimized, and that's how we're going to be mobilizing the hips. So we've got 3 exercises there. We've got exercise number 1, which is the static hip aeroplane. So we're just holding the balance and just getting used to being in that position. Flexed hip, extended hip. Holding that balance. Again, we've got the stick there if you need it, or something that you can just place your hand on. You don't want to rely on it too much, but you want to rely on it enough that you don't fall over. So that's exercise number 1. Exercise number 2 was a single leg Romanian deadlift, or essentially a single leg hip hinge. So again, we're using the stick, we're going back, and we're coming forward. Keeping this engaged, keeping this hip extended all the way through, keeping that neutral spine, so on and so forth. Exercise number 3, so we've done the hip extension part. Exercise number 3 is then moving into the rotational. So we've got internal rotation, which is where we go across like so. And then we've got external rotation, which is where we come out like so. Internal rotation, external rotation. So we're trying to get as many of the movements of the hip going as we can. So we've got those 3 exercises: static hip aeroplane to get the balance, single leg Romanian deadlift to get the sagittal plane, hip extension, hip flexion going, and then we've got the hip aeroplane where we've got hip internal rotation, hip external rotation, getting glute max, glute medius, glute minimus, trying to mobilize that, keeping the hips, spine and shoulders all in line as we turn and open out. And you can use the foot as a reference point, the chest as a reference point to try and keep those 2 in alignment. So hopefully that's been helpful. Hopefully it gives you a better idea of how you can start mobilizing the hips and developing the hip muscles to take the stress away from the lower back to give you better functioning hips and a better functioning lower back. So many thanks for watching. My name is Chris. I'll speak to you in the next tutorial.